The best way to predict the future is to create it. Abraham Lincoln. Today we're going to talk about Abraham Lincoln, his presidency, and his legacy after the war. Just a little bit about Abraham Lincoln growing up. He was born in Kentucky in 1809. During his childhood, he had a rough childhood. His mother and young brother died. Him and his father ended up moving to Indiana and eventually to Illinois. He did not get much education as a young boy because he worked so hard with his father, farming and supporting the family. But anytime he could read, he would mock miles to get books from neighbors. But he only had about 18 months of real education. He eventually became a lawyer, taught himself. He married Mary Todd. You can see the picture of her here. And he had 4 boys. 3 of them died before they reached adulthood. So he's had a pretty sad life. After being a lawyer for many years and losing many elections for the Senate and the House, he eventually gains the presidency seat in 1860. His vice president in his first term was Hannibal Hamlin, and he was nicknamed Honest Abe or the Rail Splitter, you can see there. Some of the people he wins against, one of his friends, Stephen Douglas, who he had many debates with, he ended up beating them in a very close election. If you can see, the red is who elected Lincoln, the green was Breckinridge, and he only got 40% of the vote, but ended up winning the election. Many of the Southerners did not want Lincoln as president. When Lincoln did win the presidency, he put many of his political enemies as in his cabinet. So one of the famous quotes is, "I destroy my enemies when I make them my friends." So he eventually took some of those political rivals and brought them into his presidency with him, which made him a very good president. Once he was elected, war starts. Lincoln is put in the middle of a war. He actually isn't even put in the president's seat before 7 states leave the Union. Lincoln gets busy starting to try to stop the war. He does things that Congress really didn't approve of yet. Today would be very controversial. One of the things he said at the beginning, before he was even elected, he had a very famous speech called the House Divided speech. And he said, "A house divided against itself cannot stand. That government cannot endure half free and half slave." So he knew beforehand that this was eventually going to happen, whether we were going to fight, and we could not be just half slave, half free. Something had to happen. And so the Civil War starts, one of the worst wars in U.S. history. At the beginning of the war, the Union really struggles. Lincoln is the big role. He's the commander-in-chief, so he meets with the military. He fires a lot of his generals during this time. General McClellan, which we'll talk about here in a minute, was fired from his position. And eventually Ulysses S. Grant gains the spot, which will eventually help win the war. One of the things during the Lincoln election, most people are known for him for being against slavery. But actually, here's a famous quote. "If I could save the Union without freeing any slaves, I would do it. And if I could save it by freeing all the slaves, I would do it. And if I could save it by freeing some and leaving others alone, I would also do that." One of the things he promised when the South left is, "If you don't regain and come back with the United States, I will end slavery." He threatened it, and he will later fulfill on that threat. After the Battle of Antietam, where the United States is gaining on the war, Lincoln thinks it's time to fulfill his warning. "You don't come back, I will end slavery," and so he issues the Emancipation Proclamation. And you can see in this little cartoon, you have Abraham Lincoln depicted with an axe cutting down the tree of slavery, and you can see it says Lincoln's last warning. Later in the war, as the Union is gaining momentum, after the worst battle, the Battle of Gettysburg, the 3-day battle, Lincoln goes to honor those that had died. on November 19th. He was not the key speaker. He actually was 2-minute speech after the 2-hour speech by the guy that no one ever remembers his name. But he spoke for 2 minutes. And in that short speech, he honors those that had died. And the world remembers his speech. You can see in the picture here, here is Lincoln. This is the only photograph they have of the Gettysburg Address. But the words he said, he quoted the Declaration, and he honored those. And today, we still remember that 2-minute speech. In 1864, towards the end of the war, Lincoln is reelected. He goes against his old general, George McClellan. You can see that they were not friends since Lincoln had removed him from his duties. And so Lincoln does end up beating McClellan. Lincoln's vice president for the second term was Andrew Johnson. And you can see he won pretty easily against McClellan. On April 9th, 1865, the Civil War is officially over. Lincoln's hardest job might be just starting, trying to get the United States back together. How do you take a part of the country that doesn't want to be there and try to push them back with the United States? It's a hard job, and Lincoln is the one to do it. Reconstruction after the war. It's a term you're going to hear again. Reconstruct, to rebuild. The United States needed to rebuild not only its buildings and all the things that they destroyed while they were fighting, but to rebuild the nation as the United States. Too bad Lincoln didn't get to help reconstruct our country after the war. 5 days later, after the war ended, on April 14th, Lincoln was shot in Ford's Theater. He was attending the play, Our American Cousin. He was sitting in this booth right here, and here's the stage. And John Wilkes Booth, a famous actor, knew the whole play. He had it planned out, and during the funniest part of the play, he went behind Abraham Lincoln and shot him, point blank. You can see in the picture here. He then actually fought with General Rathbone, and his wife had attended the play with Lincoln and his wife, and Rathbone tried to stab him. Robert E. Lee fought with Rathbone and eventually jumped off the balcony onto the stage. His spur caught in the American flag, and he landed on the stage, broke his leg. John Wilkes Booth yells to the crowd, "Sic semper tyrannis," which means thus always a tyrant, and he runs out, actually limps with his broken leg. He gets on a horse and takes off. This was all planned out, not only by him, but others. There were multiple people in this plan to kill Lincoln. They also wanted to kill the Vice President, Andrew Johnson, and the Secretary of State, Andrew Seward. Johnson never was any threat. They chickened out, but the Secretary of State, Seward, was stabbed multiple times, but he survived. You can see Lincoln's shot. This was the newspaper. Considered hopeless. Lincoln ended up dying the next day across the street. They had carried him into the Peterson house, and he died there. The murderer, they were big reward for the murderer. There's Booth. Eventually they do find Booth in a barn. They try to get him out by setting the barn on fire. Booth is later shot in the barn. He refuses to come out and then ends up dying of the gunshot wound. Some others, eventually they'll hang multiple people for the conspiracy to kill the president, vice president, and secretary of state. Now, Lincoln's legacy biggest legacy was the 13th Amendment, which was started during his presidency. He didn't get to see it completely ratified, but he pushed to get this to pass. The 13th Amendment ended slavery in the United States. Neither slavery nor involuntary servitude, except as punishment for a crime, shall be banned in our country. And so Lincoln didn't get to see it completely ratified, but that's his legacy, pushing and ending slavery. Even though he wasn't against slavery at the start of his presidency, he was against the spread of slavery into other places. and he looked at the economic impact. But eventually he knew that our country could not stand half free and half slave. And so he follows through with his promise to the South that if you don't rejoin, I will end slavery. And he officially ends slavery with the 13th Amendment.